Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist from Montreal, Canada on August 12, 2026. In May of this year, about 4 months after US forces kidnapped Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro, Donald Trump posted a map of Venezuela on his Truth Social account. And as you can see here up on the screen, the map showed Venezuela as the 51st state of the United States. As a Canadian, I was offended to see this because I thought that distinction was reserved for Canada. In any case, since the kidnapping of President Maduro, the government of Interim President Delcy Rodriguez has certainly adopted a much more conciliatory approach to Washington. But is Venezuela in the process of losing its sovereignty to the United States? How close is this map to representing the new political reality in the country? To help us answer this question, we have invited back onto the program the inestimable Vijay Prashad. Vijay is an chief correspondent at Globetrotter. He's an editor of Leftward Books and the director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. And he's written more than 20 books, including The Darker Nations and The Poorer Nations. Thank you very much for joining us today, Vijay.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So Vijay, by the way, just educated me on the meaning of this wording behind me. This is my home, by the way. And we discovered that H.W. Ross was, in fact, the founding editor of The New Yorker, something of which I was completely ignorant until 5 minutes ago. In any case, I've assured Vijay I'm going to be putting his name up on that piece of glass. Now, let's get into more serious matters, Vijay. Before we talk about the Venezuelan government's pro-Washington moves, I'd like to ask you about President Maduro. What do we know about his current condition, his incarceration, and the status of the criminal proceedings against him?
Very little, actually. That's what's quite shameful. I know him. He's a very interesting person, a loyal Chavista. He's sitting in New York in a cell, pretty much isolated. I sent him a box of books. I hope he's been reading them. He's allowed to access things. But, it's a very bad situation because the US government has framed charges against him, some of which the government have said subsequently aren't actually, real charges. Like, for instance, the question of narco trafficking and things like that. So it's unclear what he's being held on. They've put off the hearings. He has had a habeas hearing right after he was brought to the United States. But it's a very curious situation because it looks like, he's almost been forgotten while the situation in Caracas moves on. Delcy Rodriguez in Caracas is still called the acting president. But I think, within a few months, the National Assembly is going to just say that she's the president until the next election, which, they'll set a date for it and so on with an agreement with the opposition. I don't think anybody wants a precipitous election. They don't want the election immediately. But, I think it's a good chance that it's not going to be next year. It may be the following year. But Maduro and Celia Flores, the first combatant, largely forgotten. And the charges against them, ridiculous as they were on first reading, are now curious because we don't know what the actual charge is.
Mm-hmm. And another preliminary question I'd like to ask you, I share your views about what has happened to President Maduro and to Celia Flores. Apparently, they aren't a priority for many governments, if any, around the world today. But I also want to talk to you about the political tradition out of which they came, which is to say Chavismo. And this is a big question, Vijay, but sort of to frame our conversation, could you tell us in a nutshell what Chavismo means to you?
Yeah, so, initially when Hugo Chavez knit together sections of the patriotic social forces and the left social forces in Venezuela in the 1990s, and quixotically decided to break the stranglehold between the two relatively left and right social democratic parties of Acción Democrática and COPE, it didn't appear that Chavez would be able to dent them. They had been in power for decades, about 4 decades, one to the other, AD to Cope, etc. Chavez's coalition, in fact, smashed the gate open. And when he wins the election, it's on a mandate to put the ordinary people first. That was basically the first principle of Chavismo. Put the ordinary people first. Mr. Chavez himself came from the military, doesn't come from a political background in the sense of a sort of sectarian political party or a political tradition that was easily identifiable, but he picked up the mantle of Simon Bolivar, the uniter and liberator of the northern part of South America. And he takes Simon Bolivar's ideas, takes them seriously, studies them, studies the history of Venezuela, and excavates a kind of politics, a Bolivarian politics, putting ordinary people at the center, saying that the basic wealth of the country must be utilized to improve the conditions of people's lives, to effectively enhance the flourishing of the lives of not only Venezuelans, but people across Nuestra America or Patria Grande. These words were important to Chavez. All of the Americas, our land, and so on. And so Mr. Chavez then very quickly expropriated or made a better deal with the international oil companies, with the hydrocarbons law in 2001. That was the centerpiece of Chavismo, that the hydrocarbons in the country, their wealth, was going to be now utilized by the state in a massive redistribution project to improve housing, healthcare, education, transportation, livelihood issues of the poor, and so on. And that's exactly what they did through these missions initially. And then Chavismo matures, because Chavismo is not really a philosophy, by itself. It's a set of practices for a government. But Chavismo matures beyond the government and takes hold among beneficiaries of this Bolivarian project, people who benefited from the transfer of wealth. And these people then demand a greater place in society. And you have the creation of the communes where people live. They basically take charge of their own housing developments and their own areas of life and so on. And they become a base called the Chavistas, those who favor this kind of unfolding of a project of Chavismo. If you were to ask Mr. Chavez in 1997, what is Chavismo, he would have laughed at you. Because, he was basically building a theory by doing. I met him several times, an extraordinarily bright person, but also very interested in action. That's the military culture in him. Let's get it done. There's a problem, let's solve it. People need housing, let's get them the materials, let's annul the need for too many inspections and let them go and build their homes. And because they are already trained, skilled people and so on. And so he was very much a man of action. So Chavismo is a kind of man of action or a person of action, taking the wealth of a society, transferring it to the people, to mobilize the people to basically solve their problems. Effectively, Dimitri, that's Chavismo in the most basic sense.
So I hesitate to ask this question because it could take us down a rabbit hole, but would you say that it's fair to describe it as a socialist philosophy, Chavismo, or would you not go that far?
Well, it's certainly a socialist philosophy because, any attempt at saying that a people must have sovereignty over their wealth has within it the capacity of socialism, because you're saying that, look, the wealth of our country, mining wealth and so on, should be, decided upon democratically. You can't just hand it over to, a Canadian Barrick Gold, for instance. I mean, Barrick Gold treated Venezuela like it was its own territory. The head of Barrick Gold wrote in a Toronto newspaper that Hugo Chavez is a dictator and effectively said he needs to be removed. Mr. Monk Peter Monk, I believe his name was, the School of International Studies at University of Toronto is named after him. He was calling for regime change in Venezuela, but Mr. Monk wasn't elected in Venezuela. Chavez was, and kept getting elected. So to call him a dictator, and this is early on in Chavez's career, suggests that what was dictatorial about Chavismo was the idea that multinational corporations like Barrick Gold don't get a say in the democratic assessment of what should happen to Venezuela's gold or its precious metals, that the people must. So in that sense, it's definitely socialistic. It's definitely anti-multinational corporation, in the sense of it doesn't just say come in and enjoy.
So with that as background, and that's very helpful, thank you, Vijay. Let's turn then to some of the recent political decisions of the Delcy Rodriguez government. I'm going to start with the one that is most disturbing to me, and that is the decision, the announcement this week that Venezuela had normalized relations with Israel. By way of background, and I'm sure you know this, Vijay, but our audience might not, in 2009, President Chavez severed diplomatic relations with Israel, and he had many an occasion to condemn its vicious human rights abuses. And I just want to share with our audience an excerpt from a speech he gave in 2011. This was 1 year approximately after Israeli forces boarded the Mavi Marmara, which was trying to deliver by maritime means humanitarian goods to the besieged Gaza Strip. And this is what President Chavez had to say at the time.
Ustedes no ven el imperio yanqui. Ustedes no ven la masacre que el Estado genocida de Israel cometió contra un grupo de pacifistas que iban llevando una carga humanitaria al pueblo palestino que está en Gaza, rodeado por todos lados por Israel. No les permiten ni agua. Masacraron una gente ahí, ustedes lo vieron, ¿verdad? Bueno, vean ustedes Estados Unidos. Estados Unidos lo que dijo es que está preocupado. Están preocupados. Imagínense, Alcalá, Dios nos libre, que eso hubiera ocurrido en aguas venezolanas. Ya estaríamos invadidos. Tengan la seguridad que ya nos hubieran invadido. Pero no, como es Israel, se le permite de todo. Entonces, ese es un ejemplo de doble moral. El gobierno de Obama condena el terrorismo, siempre y cuando no sea cometido por ellos mismos.
In some ways, I find that Vijay to have been prophetic. He talked about genocide, and now we see genocide happening before our very eyes on a daily basis for almost 3 years. He talked about terroristic crimes in the waters of Venezuela, although in his hypothetical, he was positing that Venezuela was committing those crimes. In fact, what we now see and have been seeing for months is that the United States is committing open acts of terrorism in the waters off of Venezuela. Now, not only did the Delcy Rodriguez government normalize relations, but she had occasion to meet twice, apparently, with Israeli military officials. Here is a photo that was published by Venezuela Analysis. You can see these officers from the Israeli military sitting with the president, the interim president. I don't really know how to put this question to you, Vijay, in a diplomatic manner, but so I'm just going to throw this out there. What do you make of this development? And please feel free to comment on any aspect of it.
Yeah, so first, one of the soldiers that came to see Delcy Rodriguez was Brigadier General Elad Edry. Elad Edry and others, of course, commanded troops during Operation Cast Lead against the Palestinians. And it was Operation Cast Lead in 2009 that provoked Chavez to break ties with Israel. It's very interesting that, of the people that could have been sent to Caracas to see Delcy Rodriguez, the guy who made the presentation was Brigadier General Elad Edry of the Home Front Command, who's played an active role justifying this genocide. So this is not a civilian in military clothing. This is a soldier who, I think, in any other world would be considered a war criminal. And he was there in the room presenting project for the reconstruction of the future is the slideshow that he gave to the acting president of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez. Well, firstly, it's definitely a slap in the face of the tradition of Chavismo to have had this happen. I mean, I understand the pressures that a government is under. They were attacked on January 3rd. It was horrendous. They decided to tactically withdraw, to tell the United States that the United States could do this, that, and even annul effectively the hydrocarbons law of 2001, allow the US to bring military helicopter into the country, a number of things which, previously the rhetoric from the government had been, if you come, there'll be Vietnam. And that just didn't happen. So I can understand that there are all these tactical retreats. I get it. I mean, you got to meet the Israelis under US pressure. I get it. But then why not the very next day meet a delegation of Palestinians and make some statement about, Palestine? Like, there's no balancing act. Even the Indian government, which is out there, celebrating the Israelis, the next day meets the Palestinians. It's a way just to send a message saying, okay, we believe in the two-state solution. This is happening, this visit to Venezuela is happening at a time when over and over again, we are seeing, governments across Latin America, governments of the right, including now in Colombia, the government led by Abelardo de las Espriella is, they are basically welcoming the Israelis. He welcomed Israelis to his inauguration, which he had held in Cali. And at the welcome, he basically, while there was an earthquake, devastating earthquake, signed a statement saying Colombia withdraws from the Hague Group. Colombia is not going to back the South African case in the International Court of Justice. Colombia is going to recognize the Golan Heights seizure, and I think the extension beyond the Golan of Syria, and so on. This has become a big push for the Israelis and the United States in Latin America to get these countries, one after the other, to basically back the Israelis. And this is very disturbing, very, very disturbing. And again, the fact that the government of Delcy Rodriguez, acting president of Venezuela, didn't, balance it out by having some sort of meeting on Palestine, something like that, that suggests to me that they are unwilling to push back at all. And I'm pretty shocked by that, because I think I get it. Again, I'm not naive about these things. The road to Washington goes through Tel Aviv. The Americans always tell people that you want to ease things up with Washington, you got to make nice with the Israelis, Yeah. And we see that with the right-wing governments, with, for instance, De La Espriella in Colombia or Milei in Argentina, they are actually, programmatically pro-Israeli. They're programmatically Zionist, actually. Yeah, and we see that. But I will say this government is not, in Venezuela, the government led by the Socialist Party is not programmatically Zionist. They are pragmatically entering a kind of thing with the Israelis. This is pragmatic. This is not programmatic. But because it's pragmatic, there should have been a balancing act. And that there wasn't is a little disturbing to me.
Now, let's talk about the oil industry in Venezuela. There have been multiple reports that the U.S. government has effectively seized control of Venezuela's oil revenue. And I'll show you one such report. It was put out by the Council on Foreign Relations in early June, and you can see it up here on the screen. The U.S. took over Venezuela's oil industry. Where has all the money gone? And this article argued that in the first 4 months after the U.S. took control of Venezuela's oil exports, almost 100 million barrels worth an estimated $8 billion flowed through a, quote, process marked by no transparency and minimal oversight, close quote. And the article criticized the Trump regime for failing to disclose what it had done with all of this money. Is it in fact true, as far as you can tell, Vijay, that the U.S. government effectively controls the oil revenue of Venezuela? And if so, what is it doing with that money?
Yeah, so I think it's very important, Dimitri, to emphasize that the United States has taken over the oil revenues of the northern part of South America. This is not just Venezuela, Guyana as well. The government in Guyana has effectively handed over its oil to ExxonMobil. Yeah, it's effectively handed it over. So Guyana, Venezuela, and now with De La Esprilla's government in Colombia, he is going to reverse Gustavo Petro's pledge to roll back on oil production. Yeah, Petro said in the service of protecting the climate, we're going to kind of shift out. He's going to expand oil production. I can tell you, the United States is going to be all over this. So the northern coastline of the Caribbean, the oil from there is now entirely controlled by the United States and its multinational corporations. Yeah, and you ask what's happened to the oil? Well, the money. You know, Donald Trump has made no secret of his desire to take other people's wealth and money to finance things that he's interested in. Like he said openly, we should have taken the oil money from Iraq and financed the reconstruction of Iraq, with US corporations being paid through Iraqi oil money. He's very clear about that. This Venezuelan oil money is being recycled through cronies in the United States. Very clear. We'll get the facts later. Yeah, it's all very hush-hush. We don't exactly know what's going on. But what we do know, and I think what people need to pay attention to, is that the entire southern coastline of the Caribbean, from Panama down to Guyana, is effectively controlled by the United States and its oil companies. And that's shocking. And that has happened in the space of months. Yeah, it's shocking. There was a contest between Venezuela and Guyana over the Essequibo region, where ExxonMobil is very keen. There's a huge oil development block. ExxonMobil wants to drill there. The Venezuelans claimed that area, saying there's a historical dispute with Guyana. Now that dispute is going to disappear. ExxonMobil, it's going to effectively be ExxonMobil's land. Doesn't matter which country claims sovereignty. It's irrelevant. The only sovereign power in the southern coastline of the Caribbean are going to be US oil companies. They are the sovereign power, not Venezuela, not Guyana, and certainly not Colombia.
I'm curious about the mechanics of this, because this article talks about an account in a Qatari financial institution. So again, you may not know, but we may not have enough disclosure about how this actually works. But has the Venezuelan government effectively directed the purchasers of this oil to deposit the payments into a Qatari account, which is controlled by the United States? Is that the mechanics of this setup, as far as you know?
First, this actually predates the US entry on January 3rd. The Qataris had been helping the Venezuelans with finances because they were having a hard time banking. The sanctions were intense. It also happens that Delcy Rodriguez went to school with the current Emir of Qatar. And so they have a relationship from that era, and so it's helpful, you have trust and things. I mean, I'm sympathetic to a country under sanctions. You use any method to try to break the sanctions. But Qatar had been providing some sort of, monetary function for the Venezuelans. Now, I think there's trust in Qatar, but I think that it basically is a platform. It's a black box, okay? Mm-hmm. I mean, who is going to audit this oil money? Yeah, I mean, is it the National Assembly of Venezuela that should have the right to audit the oil money? I don't think so. I don't think they will exercise the right. Is the United States going to audit it? The United States is not going to bother, yeah, because it's an offshore account. Qatar is an autocracy. Yeah, they're not going to bother. There's no democratic accountability. So it's a black box. Forget it, Dimitri. This money is gone.
That's what I suspected, Vijay. So sad. Let's turn then to the whole question of privatization. According to a new article from Venezuela Analysis, Delcy Rodriguez has appointed a Venezuelan businessman by the name of Luigi Pisella to a commission that the government has established to evaluate state assets. And here's the article from Venezuela Analysis published a couple of days ago. And apparently Pisella is running around telling anyone who will listen that Venezuela should return to private investors the assets nationalized under Hugo Chavez. Could you talk to us, insofar as you can ascertain what they are, about Delcy Rodriguez's plans on the privatization front, and particularly what she has in mind in regard to those nationalized assets?
Yes, very much so. Firstly, again, this is not particular to Venezuela. I want to start the story with Rodrigo Paz in Bolivia. Bolivia, like many countries in the world, hit by the Strait of Hormuz crisis. Okay, Mr. Trump conducted an illegal war against the Iranians. The Iranians restricted traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. Oil prices hit the roof. That means fertilizer prices, food price, everything hit the roof. So all these countries are in a crisis. Bolivia seeking a 1.9 billion holdover from the International Monetary Fund has been basically informed of a suite of changes that must be made in order for this to come through. And one of the changes, and this is very important, this is happening in Argentina, it's going to happen in Chile, it's happening in Bolivia, it's going to happen in other countries in the Andes. Certainly we'll see this next in Colombia after the earthquake. We're going to see De La Estrella's government is going to enact this. We're seeing partly the entry of this into Venezuela. And what this is an investment protection law, okay? It's an investment law. It's to protect private investment in countries, so that if a Canadian company enters Bolivia and invests somewhere, its investment will be secured. In other words, there will be no possibility of nationalization, expropriation. Even in some cases, the rate of return may be guaranteed. There may be a guaranteed rate of return on investment that the exchequer would guarantee. If the economy tanks, you protect the investment of a company. Yeah, this is to lure private, in other words, mostly Western firms into these countries. Yeah, investment protection. Argentina is big on this. Venezuela is going to enter this as well. And why I'm saying this is that there is a way in which there's a way in which also these dispute settlement agreements, what used to be called investor state dispute settlement, ISDS, these things are going to be annulled. That it's going to be impossible to act. If you have a dispute with a private company that's invested in your country, there may be no avenue to actually have a dispute with them. You can't take them to court because the investment law will protect them. Okay, so part of this stuff about privatizing, don't get misled by that. That's the small fry. That's the small potatoes. Private, we need to, the real issue is if an investment law is passed to protect investment, this may also be retroactive. This may be the instrument to basically give back properties that have been expropriated previously. But even if that is not done, even if we don't retroactively do that, we're going to protect private investment in perpetuity, yeah, and protect them from lawsuits. So if they are mistreating workers or destroying the environment, there is no dispute, no place for no panel to take for dispute settlement. Yeah. So this investment law thing that the International Monetary Fund is pushing across the world, but specifically in South America, what I am seeing, because in Bolivia, Rodrigo Paz has said he's going to push through this investment law. Milei has made this a cornerstone of his economic plan, is investor protection and so on. When this comes to Venezuela, that's when you really will feel it, because Otherwise, this is just tinkering around. These are just political noises, messages to international capital. Your investment will be safe in Venezuela, but they are not going to come in unless you pass an investor protection law. Imagine, Dimitri, we are moving to a status where the only sovereign actor is going to be the multinational corporation. Yeah, the state is not going to be sovereign anymore. It's going to have no capacity to democratize the economy. Yeah, you're really reversing things back to the days of the coup governments in Latin America. When say when you had the government of Mr. Salvador Allende overthrown in Chile, and you had General Pinochet come in and basically guarantee multinational corporations that they won't get touched. Yeah, nobody's going to harass them. So that's what I'm saying. Look out for this other stuff. This is just noise right now. Yeah, this is not so significant, because these kind of statements are made on once in a while, but they're also trial balloons. They are seeing how far they can go. Yeah, we're going to protect investors. Don't worry. But the investors are saying now, through the International Monetary Fund, pass the law first.
So Vijay, I had an interesting discussion this morning with Jamal Thomas. I was on his show, and he asked me about Venezuela. And I guess this is where I'd like to conclude our discussion. I've given a lot of thought to this myself, having spent a lot of time in West Asia over the past 3 years, having been in the war zone, whether in South Lebanon, the West Bank, Iran, and seeing the horrors of it, what the West is inflicting upon any any country that asserts its own sovereignty in the face of Western corporate hegemony. And I understand completely that, as you indicated at the outset when I started asking you about the policies of Delcy Rodriguez, the very difficult situation these countries in Latin America find themselves in. And it's really not my place as somebody who lives in the West. And yes, I do report from war zones from time to time, but I'm free to leave them. I don't live there, and my children aren't there. I don't have to live with the consequences of war. It's easy for me to say, anybody living in the West, well, the Latin Americans should take up arms and resist Washington. I don't feel that that's my place. But at the same time, I'm deeply troubled by the compromises that I see these governments making. So I guess my question to you is, if you were an advisor to the governments of the region, whether it be Venezuela or Bolivia, how would you recommend that they deal with the hyper-aggression, the militarism, the total lack of human decency of the current regime in Washington?
But first, I would say this is not just the regime in Washington. That across South America, and in fact Latin America, the old oligarchic elite has not been democratized. Let me put it politely. These are not democratic societies. Bolivia, for instance, had an incredibly painful experience for Mr. Evo Morales to even win the election and then govern for 14 years with mass support. But the elite constantly tried to overthrow him, inclusive once through a coup d'etat. And then he was able to, at least his party was able to return under Luis Arce. But again, under immense constraints. Chile, I'm speaking to you from Santiago. This country has never eroded the power of the oligarchic elite. The elite that backed the murderous coup government of General Pinochet, they still govern things. The current president, Mr. Cast, his brother was a Chicago boy who was in the Pinochet government. Mr. Cast's father was a Nazi. He himself and his family made money during the coup government. None of that was overturned in the compromise years of Michelle Bachelet. So in Latin America, it's not just the United States. It's their on-the-ground ally. In Venezuela, the elite was never expropriated. It remained in situ. Some of them went to Miami to live there, but they continued to own their properties in Venezuela. Miami is the refuge of this elite, their second homes or third home, but they still maintain their homes in Bolivia, in Ecuador. They maintain their lands, their properties. That oligarchy was never overthrown. Latin America or South America is not a democratic society. it's still extremely hierarchical, racist, anti-indigenous, and so on. That harshness is right there in the soul of the society. So I would say that it's a very difficult fight. It's going to take a long time, not only to get the boot of the United States off these countries, but also to democratize the societies themselves. The only one of the Latin American countries, in my opinion, that was able to democratize was Cuba, where the Cuban Revolution effectively got rid of the old oligarchy. They moved lock, stock, and barrel to Havana, from Havana to Miami. Those that remained allowed themselves to be democratized. You don't have that elite in Cuba. In Mexico, very interesting, the 19th century saw the transformation of that elite, and then the Mexican Revolution of 1911 further deepened the transformation. I mean, Mexico had an indigenous president in Benito Juarez in the 19th century. It went through a kind of churning. Most of the societies in Latin America did not have that churning. And so this is a tough thing, because that's the ally of the United States. It's not like it's the US versus Venezuela or the US versus Bolivia. They have large elite, which is their ally in these countries, which welcomes them in. And we can never forget that we're not talking about societies that have had their quote unquote cultural transformation. They are still deeply hierarchical colonial societies in many ways. The decolonization of Latin America, in my opinion, is not yet complete.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you're saying before you can deal effectively with the external threats to sovereignty and democracy, you have to deal effectively with the internal threats. Is that a fair?
Well, both together, Dimitri. I mean, in a sense, both together. I know the story of Bolivia the best. For 14 years, Evo Morales struggled to in a sense democratize the elite. It's super racist society, Bolivia. Yeah, between the descendants of the Spanish and others and the indigenous, super divided country. Was not able to transform those social relations within the country. In Ecuador, Rafael Correa in many ways didn't transform or didn't move to transform, and there was a big split within the left between the indigenous and the Spanish descendants. Big split in the left, which continues. It's not been bridged. When you look at Peru, this is an outlandish. I mean, Pedro Castillo, who wins an election, man of the indigenous, is sitting in prison. And the old oligarchy is back in force. Yeah, Fujimori's daughter is back in charge, a woman of the right, far right. Yeah, so this has to do with these societies as well. They have not been democratically transformed. In that sense, the so-called pink tide or Bolivarianism made an enormous dent in the hemisphere, but it didn't sufficiently transform the social relations, even in Venezuela. And we see the outcome of that. That yes, there is a Chavista base which will fight, I think, to defend what they have been able to win. But I don't think it's a question of all of Venezuela versus the United States and Delcy Rodriguez. There's a class struggle within the country that we have to recognize.
Well, Vijay, always a tremendous pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us today, and look forward to our next conversation.
Me too. Thanks.
Thank you. And we're signing off today from Montreal on August 12, 2026.